Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak again on this grand occasion as this Juneteenth festival celebrates GAR's first anniversary. Too often, we have been conditioned to think that we have no history or anything to be proud of, but we have a very, very rich history. It is simply that we have to be reminded from whence we have come and the struggles we have endured in order to appreciate our past and those who came before us. That is why it's so important that celebrations such as this are held. Many young people have the misguided perception that our history is totally separate from American history and that African American history consists solely of slavery and the civil rights movement. Some people also believe that there are only a few Americans of African descent that have done anything substantial in our history, so that it can easily be discussed in a few days in February during Black History Month by merely mentioning Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and the Peanut Man, George Washington Carver, and a few others. Those who hold those beliefs are wrong. Even if we discuss the history of African Americans in Kent County and their contributions to this region, the state, and the nation, it would take more than 1 month. Even a brief discussion of that topic would take days. We know that slavery did exist in this area as early as 1650. We also know that all blacks were not slaves, and many of those who were slaves gained their freedom. Unfortunately, we as historians and researchers have not adequately utilized existing documentation to support or even to refute erroneous statements because many common practices prevented free blacks and slaves from learning to read and write. So the documentation that exists was primarily written and interpreted about us and not by us, which often skewed the findings. Most people don't even know that free blacks and slaves did serve in the War of 1812. Until recently, credible evidence has been written about the story of our history in this nation. For example, by 1790, only 11% of the African Americans in Kent County were free. But by 1860, 58% were free. The number of free African Americans in Kent County nearly tripled, and the percentage grew about 10% every year between 1790 and 1860. Another impression is that slaves only knew how to work in the fields. But many slaves were skilled laborers, and when they had the opportunity, they worked and earned extra money on their own time and purchased their freedom as well as that of their relatives. Those slaves who had no opportunity or hope to purchase their freedom or that of their relatives escaped, even with the help of Harriet Tubman and others associated with the Underground Railroad. Many escaped even before the Underground Railroad came into existence. Many of those escapes were often from locations close by, such as Georgetown Crossroads area. Many of them arrived in Philadelphia, and some of them even went on to Canada. Some of those ex-slaves helped to establish all black towns in Canada, with many others who lived there, and after the Civil War, they returned to this area. Many laws prevented slaves and free blacks from learning to read and write, but research has shown that many African Americans in this county could do so in spite of the laws. Laws were also passed that did not allow free blacks or slaves to remain on the streets in Chestertown after 10 o'clock at night. Due to the laws that were in force, there is the impression that slaves were submissive, docile, and childlike. That is not true. Due to the large number of slaves that escaped and rebelled against slavery, better known as the institution of the peculiar institution or peculiar system, that is definitely not true. Maybe one of the best examples of a slave who was not childlike or submissive was from this county. His name was Henry Highland Garnett. Henry Highland Garnett was born in 1815. For the first 9 years of his life, he was a slave until 1824, when his father, under the pretense of going to a funeral, took his family and other relatives to freedom. They first went to Wilmington, Delaware. From there, they went to Pennsylvania and then to New York, where they changed their names. 2 years after the family escaped, he enrolled in the New York African Free School, where he joined other students who were of national fame. One of those individuals was Ira Aldrich, who became the Shakespearean actor. A second individual was Samuel Ringo Ward, also an escaped slave from the area. Those individuals came together for the purpose of trying to help other slaves escape. Garnett became the leader of the group. He and his classmates rebelled against the system because they planned not to celebrate the 4th of July until slavery ended. Garnett became highly educated, but that did not assure him of a job that would take care of his needs. So, even though he had an education, he became a sailor for 2 years and sailed to Cuba. When he returned to New York, he found that his family had been visited by slave catchers. The family had dispersed in an attempt to avoid recapture. In the process, his mother and sister had been arrested as fugitive slaves. They were later released, but in the process, they lost all of their possessions that they had accumulated. For 2 years, Henry Highland Garnett lived with Quakers, and from them, he became deeply religious. Around the age of 18, Henry Highland Garnett injured his knee, and his leg became so infected that he couldn't even walk on it. He had to use crutches. For 13 years, he used crutches until his leg was amputated up to the hip. But he didn't stop there. He continued his education. And when he continued his education, he learned that a school was opening in New Canaan, in New Hampshire. That school was called Knowles Academy. He was accepted as a student, but in order to get to the school, he had to travel over 400 miles. In traveling 400 miles, he could not sleep in any bed because that was not allowed. He couldn't sleep in a bed where whites would sleep, or even in the inns. And he didn't even have the benefit of having the opportunity of getting food. He also traveled on a stagecoach. He had to ride on top, regardless of the weather. Okay? When he arrived at the school in New Hampshire, he was accepted by the students, but not by the townspeople. The townspeople did not want black students there. So they took 90 oxen and moved the school off of its base. And they threatened the students and told them to leave. Henry Highland Garnett and the black students left. They went to New York, and in New York he learned that a school had just opened in Whitesboro called Oneida. He was accepted and he graduated in 1839. Garnett became a major supporter of abolition. By 1840, he had become the pastor of a newly organized church. He also started a school for black boys and girls. His church became a meeting place for abolitionists. And Henry Highland Garnett often stated that his church harbored hundreds of slaves and assisted others on their way to freedom. At a convention in 1843, Garnett delivered a speech entitled An Address to the Slaves of the United States. In that speech, he stated that there is little hope of obtaining freedom without some shedding of blood. Brethren, arise, arise, strike for your lives and liberties. Now is the day and hour. Let every slave throughout the land do this, and the days of slavery are numbered. You cannot be more oppressed than you have been. Rather die freemen than live to be slaves. Remember that you are 4 million. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. Remember, you are 4 million. Henry Highland Garnett had become such a radical that he could have been a 19th century H. Rap Brown. No one had ever made a speech telling slaves to take up arms and to kill their owners. He was the first of the abolitionists to propose the use of violence in order to free slaves. He also encouraged blacks to immigrate to Africa because of the racism and discrimination that existed here. By 1850, Garnett favored voluntary immigration in order to establish a cotton region in hopes of destroying the economic base of the Southern economy. He stated that he would rather see a man free in Liberia than a slave in the United States. He said blacks should go anywhere where they can better themselves. By 1850, he knew that he was not safe anywhere within the United States because of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. So he simply said, it's time to leave. In the winter of 1855, he returned to the United States and became the pastor of a church in New York City. In New York, he raised money to purchase the freedom of slaves. He also helped to eliminate the slave trade at its source. By 1857, Henry Highland Garnett had become such a militant opponent of slavery that John Brown was interested in recruiting him for his raid in Harper's Ferry. But once the Civil War began, Garnett and members of his church raised money and collected clothing for slaves who escaped. He also recruited troops for the Union Army, especially for the famous 54th Massachusetts and the 20th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Garnett temporarily assumed the duties of the chaplain of the recruits, but because of the loss of his leg, he was disqualified for the position. But that still did not stop him. After the war ended, he organized blacks into equal rights movements in order to fight for fairness, justice under the law, and the right to vote. By 1863, he had become the pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and he became the first African American to deliver a sermon in Congress when he spoke in the House of Representatives to celebrate the end of slavery. That prolific man served as the editor of 3 newspapers in which he tried to influence blacks to become politically active, to become self-sufficient, and he supported black nationalism. In 1882, he became the United States ambassador to Liberia and died there a month later. Henry Highland Garnett, the journalist, minister, missionary, abolitionist, and civil rights activist, was above all the first black nationalist, and he was from here. H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, and other black nationalists of the 20th century would have been proud to have had Garnett at their side. Garnett definitely was not docile, he was not childlike, and therefore that impression that some slaves were childlike or docile should be dispelled. The life and struggles of Garnett were honored when the Henry Highland Garnett School was built here in Chestertown in 1915 to serve African American students in grades 1 through 12. The building of the school for students 1 through 12 was a feat in itself because most schools built for African Americans across the state of Maryland and the nation only went to 9th, 10th, or the 11th grades. So as such, Chestertown was ahead of most other places. Another impression of African Americans that most people have is that free blacks and slaves labored only in the fields. That impression is incorrect because they worked in many other occupations such as brick makers, waiters, coachmen, sailors, butchers, musicians, preachers, teachers, wagon drivers, barbers, and numerous others, while women worked primarily as housekeepers, as washerwomen, dressmakers, and teachers. As researchers, we must expand those categories. We also know that there were free blacks from this county who became quite prosperous and made differences in the black community. Some of those individuals from here included the landowner and grocer, James Jones, the restaurant owner, William Perkins, the saloon keeper, Levi Rogers, the shad and herring fishery owners, Thomas Cuff and Samuel Perkins, the stable and delivery owner, Isaac Boyer, and ice cream and confectionery owner, Maria Brecker, and others. They also owned land, which they bought and sold to and from each other, which was often close to their churches. But most of all, they worked together. They supported each other. They loaned money to each other and financed mortgages for each other. In short, they had economic, social, and religious ties that helped them to survive during and after slavery. There are also hints that some of those free blacks in this county helped some slaves to escape with and without the assistance of the Underground Railroad prior to the Civil War. Politically, those free blacks, especially Perkins and James Jones, represented Chestertown at the first political convention held by and for African Americans at the first political convention held in Baltimore in 1852. They spoke in favor of blacks moving to Africa due to the harsh treatment received by free blacks and slaves in America. After the Civil War, Perkins supported the right of African Americans to vote under the 15th Amendment. He also became the first African American Maryland delegate to a national Republican convention and the Eastern Shore's first African American federal grand juror. During the Civil War, dozens of slaves were turned into soldiers and fought for the Union Army. Those brave soldiers fought, died, and others were injured for the Union cause and their freedom. At the end of the war, most of the surviving soldiers returned to this area and began to organize among themselves and to try to make life better for themselves, their dependents, and this community. As a result, those veterans formed a fraternal and social organization associated with the Grand Army of the Republic. That nationwide organization formed in 1866, just after the end of the war, and was composed of honorably discharged veterans of the Union Army, the United States Navy, the Marines, and the Revenue Cutter Service, now known as the United States Coast Guard. Those local African American veterans and the members of this community took out a mortgage to build that magnificent structure that has been renovated, known as Charles Sumner Post number 25. This structure is believed to be the only remaining African American Grand Army of the Republic Lodge in Maryland, and one of the only 2 African American Civil War veteran lodges in the United States. The GAR linked veterans of shared experiences, and it was the first organized group that fought to support and to protect the newly won voting rights of black veterans. It also lobbied the United States Congress for pensions for veterans and political rights during a time of violence against them, and attempts to prevent them from receiving any rights whatsoever. Those brave soldiers should be applauded for their foresight and efforts to build this structure that has been renovated and reopened. Those groups, concerned citizens, community action groups, and preservationists who work so diligently to preserve that post, to research its history, and the history of this area should also be commended as well, or else that particular piece of history for this area would have been lost forever. Those are not empty platitudes, because it takes a great deal of time, energy, and effort to preserve history, because it is so much easier for it to be lost. Unfortunately, each day of our history is being forgotten, because too many people in high positions tend to believe that history, older people such as myself, old buildings and institutions are not important. However, if it were not for the older members of the community talking about the past and repeating their memories of bygone days, we would not have the history of the area or of any area. Sadly, once the elders pass on to the great beyond, that history and legacy will be gone as well, because there are very few people concerned with preserving the past. The reality is that it is our past that has provided the foundation for the present and the future. It is our past that has given our elders knowledge, experience, and the belief that we can be better than we have been in the past. It was that realization or reality check that has inspired them to look backwards, to preserve time-worn values, and to preserve institutions from destruction. As such, it is only fitting and proper that this Juneteenth festival celebrates GAR's first anniversary. Juneteenth, or June 19th, 1865, was when slaves in Galveston, Texas, found out that they were free. June 19, 1865 was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued by President Abraham Lincoln. In many respects, Juneteenth is symbolic of what can happen when we do not know our history, which means we basically remain enslaved by ignorance of facts. As a result, we do not know the truth about ourselves, and we simply accept what we are told. That should not ever happen again, and we should make every effort to know our history. We have a very rich history, but we must research it. We must reclaim it. We must write about it. We must teach it to others and pass it down to the next generation. Otherwise, it will be lost forever. There are certain things that we must do to preserve our history. One, we must talk to our elders because they know the history, the stories, remember the events and the names, even though they may not voluntarily and openly talk about them unless we ask about them. We must sit at their feet and listen, because once they have passed on, the stories and memoirs are gone forever. The death of each and every elder means the loss of a dictionary or encyclopedia. For those of the younger generation, before computers, iPhones, etc., dictionaries and encyclopedias were those huge books that explained to readers what something meant. Two, we must read and continue to read about our history, because much of our history is in those huge things called books, in letters, diaries, and documents that we are often reluctant to read. We simply have to read them and be about the business of acquiring knowledge. Hopefully, we will learn something about ourselves. Three, we must collect obituaries of family members, friends, and members of our community, because each obituary is a history of that person's life and his or her involvement in the community. Each obituary contains vital information, including where he or she went to school, their occupational training, military status, the names of the parents, names of the siblings, names of children, and mention some close friends, memberships in organizations and affiliations, including religious and political affiliations, etc. Obituaries are social networks, but they are much more accurate than Facebook, Twitter, and other forms of popular media. 4, we must collect, restore, identify, name, and share pictures of family members so that members of the next generation would know who their ancestors were, how they were related, and ascertain their stories. 5, we must record family stories as told to us by the elders because the stories also tell family history, funny events, historical occasions, as well as successful and unsuccessful ventures. Excuse me. The stories may also reveal other information that may have been forgotten for generations. 6, we must hold family reunions or family gatherings in order to share stories which might just heal some old family wounds and end community conflicts. Those stories may also reveal things that happened in the community many years in the past that may have had lasting effects on individuals and family members. 7, we must collect school yearbooks, community newsletters, local church bulletins, and gather local history from those sources. Minutes from local community meetings are also a source of political and social events. And number 8, check with local historic societies and strip newspaper archives to see what history they have preserved over the years. If you have done research on your own over the years, share it with the Historic Society because your research may just fill some gaps in local history that is unknown to them. That give and take can also go both ways by learning from each other because American history is shared history. Just those few tidbits that I have shared with you about local Chestertown and Kent County history is awesome history. And it is not just about slavery and civil rights. As a people, we have lived and died, worked and persevered for over 400 years in this country. But too much of our shared history has not survived for obvious reasons. Fortunately, and to the credit of all who have contributed to the renovation of Charles Sumner Post 25, the task has already begun here to save this history. The renovation of the post was a cooperative, most glorious task, but more, much more, must be done, and it would take all of the members of this community working in concert to accomplish this goal. It cannot be done without each of you doing your part to preserve the history. How many of you would take on the role of a modern day Henry Highland Garnett, a Maria Breaker, an Isaac Boyer, Thomas Cuff, Will Perkins, the soldiers that cooperated with each other to build the Charles Sumner Post and many others? Those individuals were able to achieve so very much as slaves, free blacks, as soldiers who served in the Civil War with little or no education, and yet they persevered. The question that I am asking of each of you is how much are each of you willing to do to save your history with the amount of technology, education, and computer savvy that you have at your disposal in this technologically driven 21st century? The task has begun, but it must continue if you want your history to survive and prosper. My challenge to each of you is to get involved because it is your history, and if you do not care about it, it will surely die from neglect.